Hi everyone. In this important lecture, we are going to answer a few questions. First, are triggers still relevant? We're also going to explain the migraine threshold model and why it matters. I'm going to talk about how the conventional model of migraine attack trigger identification and avoidance is outdated and incorrect. So for decades, we focused almost exclusively on the trigger-focused model, the trigger identification model, and of course, avoidance that comes with it as part of migraine lifestyle changes. While this seems logical, emerging research suggests it may be incomplete and even harmful, potentially limiting migraine patients' progress. However, the threshold model proposes that a threshold level determines whether triggers lead to migraine attacks. So it's not as simple as trigger then a migraine attack. Common denominator is threshold. So are triggers even relevant? This is the question we're going to answer today. So as stated earlier, our current model of migraine management centers around a bare bones premise. Identify triggers, avoid them, prevent migraine attacks. But this approach has several critical flaws. First is our ability to accurately identify triggers is incredibly poor. In fact, research shows that only about 18% of self-reported triggers hold up to statistical analysis. So let's look at some examples. Neck pain is confirmed as a trigger in only 44% of cases when patients believed it was causal. And it's probably even less than this because it's a prodrome symptom and migraine attacks cause referred pain to the neck. Next, we have bright lights at 36%, stress at 26%, and dehydration at 16%. So more often than not, human memory and pattern recognition are prone to confabulation. This is our brain's tendency to create explanations for experiences that it doesn't fully understand. We notice the chocolate we ate prior to a migraine attack, but we overlook our own physiology as it's not immediately verifiable. And even if we could identify the triggers, the timing between exposure and migraine attack onset can vary dramatically. Therefore, it makes this cause and effect relationship nearly impossible to establish. So let's look at celiac disease, for example. When someone with celiac consumes gluten, their symptoms don't always appear immediately. Research shows reactions can occur anywhere from 10 minutes to 48 hours after exposure, with some individuals not experiencing symptoms for days or even weeks. Some people react within an hour, while others might not feel anything until the next day. Migraine attack triggers work the same way. There are immediate triggers, delayed reactions, or cumulative effects. Now, these could even be the same triggers, which makes this even more difficult. So that glass of red wine might trigger a migraine attack immediately for one patient, 6 hours later for another, or combined with other factors to trigger an attack a day later for someone else, or even the same person. So how can patients possibly identify triggers with such variable timing? This cause and effect tracking has not been shown to be verifiable. Now, even if we somehow solve the identification and timing problems, the trigger-focused approach has other serious limitations that hinder effective migraine management. For example, many migraine attack triggers just can't be avoided. These include weather changes, hormonal fluctuations, barometric pressure shifts. These environmental and physiological factors are completely outside patient control. So when we emphasize trigger avoidance as the primary strategy, we're setting patients up for inevitable failure. Also, the lifestyle restrictions are incredibly prohibitive. To ensure rigorous trigger avoidance, one must agree to living an incredibly burdensome lifestyle. Imagine telling patients to avoid stress, maintain perfect sleep, never miss a meal, avoid all weather changes, and steer clear of countless foods and sensory stimuli. The resulting lifestyle becomes so restrictive that it creates its own stresses and limitations. In fact, when we talk about eating, we can even say it might lead to eating disorders, which migraine patients have been shown in research to be at an increased risk of. So while implementing a strategy for migraine treatment, it might actually lead to further disorders. Another comorbid illness or comorbid illnesses that migraine patients deal with are depression and anxiety. This prohibitively restrictive lifestyle will only cause exacerbation of this, and therefore it will result in a cycle that will make migraine even harder to treat and therefore worsen depression and anxiety in migraine patients. So trigger avoidance can actually lead to an increased risk of treatment-resistant migraine. Furthermore, the trigger-focused model fails to explain a fundamental question. Why does the same trigger, or even combinations of triggers, cause a migraine attack and sometimes does not? A glass of wine, for example, might trigger a severe migraine attack one day, but have no effect another day. This inconsistency cannot be explained by triggers alone. The current model also puts the entire burden entirely on the patient and on the patient's behavior. This suggests that if they just avoid triggers carefully enough, they'll prevent attacks. This creates unhealthy self-blame when attacks inevitably occur despite avoidance efforts. Finally, focusing exclusively on triggers ignores the underlying neurophysiology of migraine. Migraine is a complex neurological condition involving cortical spreading depression, involves trigeminal activation, and central sensitization. By fixating on environmental triggers, we miss the opportunity to address the fundamental neural mechanisms driving this condition. Now, this is where the migraine threshold model comes in. At its core, this model proposes that migraine is not just about the presence of triggers, but about your brain's susceptibility to those triggers at any given moment. So think of your migraine threshold as a neurological tipping point. Looking at the visual here, you can see several key concepts. First, each person has a genetic baseline, a baseline susceptibility to migraine attacks that is based on genetics and neurophysiology. Some people naturally just have higher threshold than others. Second is the fact that the threshold is dynamic. It's constantly fluctuating up and down, and it's based on both internal and external factors. It's not static. Third, multiple factors simultaneously influence your threshold. Sleep quality, stress levels, hormonal status, and many other factors all stack together to either raise or lower your threshold at any given time. And when these combined factors cross the threshold line, a migraine attack begins. It's not just one trigger, but the cumulative effect of many factors. This explains why the same trigger has different effects depending on your current threshold. You can be exposed to a trigger without consequence on, let's say, Tuesday, but the same trigger may result in a debilitating migraine attack on Friday. The trigger is not what changed. It's the threshold that did. Now, it's important to understand that the threshold model isn't just a theoretical concept. It has a solid foundation in neurophysiology. At the cellular level, neurons have what's called an action potential threshold. This is the minimum level of electrical stimulation needed for a neuron to fire. So on the example on the left, which shows an action potential, the minimum needed for this specific action potential is negative 55 millivolts. So the resting membrane potential is at negative 70 millivolts. A stimulus is needed so that the neuron can depolarize just enough to reach the threshold and then continue with the depolarization. As you can see here, these are failed initiations because a signal will not be sent. It will not propagate through a neuron unless the threshold is reached. So even if there is a stimulus, but it doesn't depolarize enough, it will not be felt. And I say felt because we are referring to pain. So this isn't a theory. This is basic neurophysiology. In migraine, there's also cortical spreading depression. It's a wave of neuronal depolarization. And cortical spreading depression in recent studies have actually been shown to be a key to triggering the pain cascade. So for this to occur, enough neurons must reach their action potential threshold nearly simultaneously. Of course, it looks different than a neuronal action potential, which is this, because we're talking about the cortex. However, it's a similar idea. So what the migraine threshold model describes at the clinical level, it directly mirrors what happens at the cellular level. And various factors can lower the action potential threshold of neurons, making them more easily excitable and more likely to fire in response to stimuli that wouldn't normally trigger them. And then here I included some factors that lower neuronal thresholds. Again, the threshold is not static. So when we talk about your migraine threshold, we're actually describing a measurable physiological phenomenon. The collective excitability of neurons in pain processing pathways and their susceptibility to triggering the cascade of events that lead to a migraine attack. Now, to understand threshold fluctuations, let's look at the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is below the thalamus, hence why it's called hypothalamus, and it's above the anterior and posterior pituitary here. So this is a small but crucial brain region acting as the body's homeostatic control center. And why is this important? Because anything, and I mean anything, that alters the body's homeostasis is a potential migraine attack trigger. Furthermore, Neuroimaging studies actually show hypothalamic activation up to 48 hours before migraine attack onset. So by the time you actually process a migraine attack is occurring, the hypothalamus was already activated 48 hours prior. So this is another reason why it's very hard to correlate any individual triggers. Now, the hypothalamus regulates hunger signals, sleep-wake cycles, stress hormone production, pain perception pathways, temperature regulation, and fluid balance. These systems directly influence your migraine threshold. Disruption in any of them can lower your threshold, making you more vulnerable to triggers that might otherwise have been tolerated. So it's not actually about controlling triggers, but about controlling the threshold. So instead of talking about trigger management, we need to focus more on threshold management. And that's what we'll do. If the trigger model leads us to focus primarily on avoidance, the threshold model suggests a more empowering approach, threshold management. So instead of merely avoiding triggers, threshold management focuses on raising your neurological resilience. So there is a 4-step process here. So the first step in threshold management is not avoiding triggers per se, but setting up a schedule. That means time is important. The time you sleep, the time of meals, and finally, stress management. Then recognizing symptoms. Those warning signs before a headache, like yawning, mood changes, or food cravings, they're not just predictions, but that means that the migraine attack has already begun. The threshold has been crossed if you're recognizing symptoms. When you feel like something is a trigger, it's more likely than not a symptom of a migraine attack. Not a warning that a migraine attack will begin. A migraine attack has already started. It's in the process and therefore requires treatment. Recognizing symptoms means decreasing central sensitization. It means potentially not allowing the migraine attack to progress, causing further damage to your nervous system. Next is preventive treatment. Many migraine preventives work precisely by raising the threshold, stabilizing neuronal excitability, reducing inflammation, or regulating neurotransmitter function. In fact, recent studies suggest that anti-CGRP monoclonal antibodies may actually be disease modifying. That is, they may change the course of the disease. Next is addressing the comorbidities. Conditions like anxiety, depression, and sleep disorders significantly impact threshold, and treating them will raise the threshold. So I mentioned prodrome in the other slide. Now let's be more detailed. Most migraine patients, 77%, experience prodrome symptoms. Again, this means that the migraine attack has begun. The migraine attack has begun. You can't avoid a migraine attack by paying attention to prodrome symptoms. The process started. At this point, you can only abort a migraine attack. Again, these aren't warnings. So you have mood changes. So you may be feeling depressed, anxious, or irritable. There may be physical symptoms. So fatigue, neck stiffness, yawning, or sensitivity to light or sound. Appetite changes. Some people may experience a change in appetite during the prodrome phase. So cravings for certain foods, or even a loss of appetite, constipation or diarrhea, changes in bowel movements, and sensory changes. Not aura, but some people have a heightened sense of smell or taste. So this is an important quote I wrote. We must acknowledge that triggers only matter in the context of threshold. The goal isn't complete trigger avoidance, but raising the threshold high enough that trigger exposure doesn't cross it. So challenging the routine is best for the migraine brain paradigm. So the threshold model also challenges this common migraine management recommendation. How many times have we heard the migraine brain loves routine? This might actually be harmful advice. It's better said that the migraine brain loves schedules, not routines. So sleeping at the same time, eating at the same time, those are schedules, not routines. Schedules are good for homeostasis. Routines put you in a cycle that makes you dependent, and we'll get to more of that in a bit. So while consistency helps, emerging research suggests it may have limitations. So this recent study in the Journal of Headache and Pain divided mice into 2 environmental conditions. They put them in a standard environment or an enriched environment. The standard environment had basic, predictable conditions, smaller cage. The enriched environment had a bigger cage, various stimuli. They had toys, exercise equipment, and also social opportunities. After repeatedly injecting the mice with nitroglycerin to create a condition that mimics chronic migraine in humans, this is what researchers call a chronic migraine model, or inducing a chronic migraine model, researchers observed these patterns. The mice in the standard environment with basic predictable conditions had less resilience to pain, higher CGRP levels, and more neuroinflammation. In the enriched environment with various stimulating conditions, they had reduced pain sensitivity, lower CGRP levels, decreased inflammation, and normalized excitatory signaling. So while routine might help avoid immediate threshold drops, it could reinforce sensitivity patterns long term. Controlled environmental enrichment, by contrast, appears to build neurological resilience, raising the baseline threshold. And that is the point. So, an important question we have to answer: could the advice stating that the migraine brain loves routine be limiting recovery? Because it did for the mice in this study. Now let's look at the traditional approach. We had a focus on trigger identification. Oh, let me keep a diary or a journal and identify when I had my migraine attack and what I ate. Let me try an elimination diet and see if that works. Oh, I smelled something on my way home, so that probably caused my migraine attack. That was the entire focus: trigger identification. Success was measured by triggers avoided. I didn't go to this event with bright lights and people wearing perfumes, and therefore I avoided triggers. Therefore, I am successful. Therefore, it had restrictive recommendations. It limited the patient's activities and options. It limited their life. In contrast with the threshold approach, the assessment focus shifts to comprehensive threshold assessment. So beyond just trying to identify triggers, meticulously keeping a journal to go trigger hunting, we evaluate baseline threshold factors like sleep quality, stress management, hormonal influences, comorbidities. Treatment planning evolves to include multiple intervention points. Rather than just providing trigger avoidance lists, we develop comprehensive threshold management plans that address various aspects of the condition. And success is not based off trigger avoidance. It's based on resilience. That's how we should measure it. The ability to encounter a potential trigger without crossing the threshold. By doing this, long-term management strategies focus on balance. We balance protective routines with controlled variety to potentially modify underlying neurological sensitivity. This results in happiness, this sadness. Now, what are the benefits of the threshold model? Why does this shift in thinking matter for patients? Well, first, it reduces self-blame. Migraine patients will have migraine attacks. Sometimes triggers affect them, sometimes they don't. The inconsistency makes patients believe that they're at fault. Oh, I shouldn't have went out. I shouldn't have went to my friend's birthday party. Migraine patients have to stop blaming themselves. The threshold model provides them with an opportunity to raise the threshold and not be concerned as much about triggers. Furthermore, it provides more intervention options. Rather than just avoiding triggers, patients have multiple strategies they can employ to raise their threshold. Third, it moves patients from restriction to resilience. Instead of constantly narrowing their lives, they can work on expanding their capacity. And that's what it's all about. Living life normally with less disability. The trigger model prevents this from occurring. Fourth, it explains why preventive treatments help regardless of trigger exposure. Patients often notice improvement even when they haven't changed their exposure to triggers, and that's because the threshold has been increased. Lastly, it gives patients more control over their condition. More strategies can be employed. Now, looking at our visual here, we can see the difference. Trigger management is like constantly dodging obstacles. There's a hole in the ground. Oh, I can't fall through. I have to dodge it. While raising the threshold is almost like putting up a bridge. It allows you to rise above those obstacles so that the obstacles do not interfere with your life. And this is the goal of the threshold model. Now, the threshold model doesn't invalidate trigger management. It contextualizes it within a more complete framework. So it focuses on raising the threshold so we address the underlying vulnerability that makes triggers problematic in the first place. And again, patients can move from avoidance to resilience, from a life of constantly restricting activities to one of gradually building capacity and expanding possibilities. For migraine patients, this shift in thinking can be transformative, changing their fundamental relationship with their condition and expanding their therapeutic horizons. Thank you, and please leave any questions you have in the comments.